Imagine a young leader standing on the edge of a rugged hill, wind in his face, heart pounding with a question bigger than any battle. Will the world ever see my people as a true nation? That was Afonso Henriques. He had courage, he had victories, and he had a dream that would not let him sleep. But to turn a dream into a kingdom, he needed something stronger than steel. He needed recognition that could cross borders and silence doubt. He needed the blessing of the church. Now picture this. It is late spring in the year 1179, and in Rome a decision is sealed. Pope Alexander III signs a document that carries the weight of centuries. It does not place a crown on a head in a ceremony, but it does something even more powerful. It tells the world that Portugal is not a rebellious corner of someone else's realm. It is a kingdom, a real one, and Afonso is its king. The document has a name that sounds almost like a verdict from history itself. Manifestis Probatum, proven by what is evident. Before we get lost in the parchment and the seals, let us step back and meet the man behind this moment. Afonso did not grow up expecting the world to applaud him. He was the son of a count, born into a frontier life where stone castles rose from fields of risk. He fought for survival along the shifting line between Christian lands and Muslim powers in the west of the Iberian Peninsula. After the Battle of Henriques in the year 1139, he declared himself King of Portugal. It was bold, and many saw it as a challenge rather than a coronation. Some even whispered that he dreamed too loudly. Here is the quiet truth that often gets lost in the noise of battles. In the 12th century, swords could win land, but only the Pope could give a realm its place among kingdoms. Afonso knew this. He sent letters to Rome. He made promises. He gave land to monasteries and welcomed religious orders that could build not only churches but also networks of influence and education. He invited Cistercian monks to settle, people famous for turning wild fields into living communities. He wanted Portugal to look like a nation that could endure. There is a curious detail from this era that reveals just how human and complicated these negotiations were. Conflicts with bishops were not simply arguments at a table. They were tense, personal, and sometimes clumsy efforts to gain leverage in a world where the church was both a spiritual guide and a political force. Afonso could be stubborn, and his circle could be fiercely protective of the cause. Even so, through missteps and reconciliations, he kept his eyes on the same horizon, legitimacy that no rival could deny. Meanwhile, his cousin to the east, Afonso of León, watched closely. Years earlier, they had reached an agreement at Zamora that acknowledged Portugal's path, but that was not the final chapter. Think of it like a handshake in a crowded room, helpful but not the same as a public announcement from the most trusted authority in Europe. Without the Pope's voice, Portugal was still vulnerable to the tides of politics, family claims, and old maps that refused to change. So Afonso played a long game. He kept building. He founded towns with charters that promised fairer terms for settlers. He supported churches that anchored communities. He protected pilgrims who were crossing the peninsula on their way to sacred places. He wrote to Rome again and again. That is something we often forget. Nation building can feel like a march of armies, but it is just as often a steady rhythm of letters, oaths, and the quiet work of people who believe in a shared future. Then comes the day that changes everything. Manifestis Probatum. The words are clear and careful. They recognize Afonso as King of Portugal. They place his realm under the protection of St. Peter and the Holy See. That phrase might sound ceremonial, but in the 12th century it meant safety, legitimacy, and the promise that other rulers could not simply erase Portugal with a stroke of a pen or a sudden campaign. It meant that a new voice had officially joined the chorus of Europe. There is another detail that gives color to this moment. The document did not praise only battles. It also highlighted service to the Christian cause, the defense of borders, and the care for church lands. It presented Portugal as a responsible member of a wider Christian world. That framing helped other courts accept the news. It was not just about a king's ambition. It was about a community taking its place within a shared order. Afonso did not live forever, of course. He died in the year 1185, a few years after the bull was issued. But by then the essentials were in place. A recognized crown, a defined purpose, and a network of towns and monasteries that could carry the story forward. Some historians like to say that Portugal was one of the first modern states in Europe to hold a clear sense of its boundaries and its laws. That clarity did not appear overnight. It grew from choices made in fields, in councils, and in the quiet rooms where letters were written by candlelight. Here is something to carry with you. We often talk about independence as a matter of banners and battles, but this story reminds us that it is also about belonging. Portugal did not step away from the world to become itself. It stepped into a larger community and learned to speak in its language, the language of faith, law, and alliance. Afonso's gift was not only courage, it was patience, persistence, and the ability to weave power and belief into a shared narrative that others could accept. So when you hear the name Manifestis Probatum, think of more than a medieval document. Think of a people asking to be seen. Think of a leader who understood that a nation is built with trust as much as with towers. And think of the moment when a signature in Rome allowed a dream on the Atlantic's edge to become a country with a future. If stories like this spark your curiosity, stay with us, because history is full of quiet turning points that changed everything in ways we can still feel today. If you love history and want to keep exploring these quiet crossroads where belief and curiosity meet, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and join us for the next chapter. There are more stories to tell and more soft-spoken moments that change the world. Picture this, a young man born into nobility, but not the kind of nobility that guarantees you a throne. Afonso Henriques was the son of Count Henry of Burgundy, a French nobleman who had come to the Iberian Peninsula to fight the Moors and ended up ruling a small county called Portugal. But here's where the story gets fascinating. Henry died when Afonso was just 3 years old, leaving behind a widow and a child in a world where power was everything. His mother, Teresa of León, became regent, but she made a choice that would haunt young Afonso for years. She fell in love with a Galician nobleman and began making decisions that many saw as betraying Portuguese interests. Imagine being a teenager and watching your own mother seemingly hand over your inheritance to foreign nobles. That's exactly what shaped Afonso Henriques into the determined leader he would become. By the time he reached adulthood, Afonso had learned a harsh truth. In the 12th century, you were either a ruler or you were ruled. There was no middle ground. So, in 1139, after what would become known as the legendary Battle of Ourique, he did something unprecedented. He proclaimed himself King of Portugal. Not Duke, not Count, but King. It was an audacious move that sent shockwaves through the Christian kingdoms of Iberia. But here's what most people don't realize about medieval politics. Calling yourself king and actually being recognized as one were two completely different things. It's like declaring yourself the CEO of a company that no one acknowledges exists. Afonso Henriques had won battles, he had territory, he had loyal followers, but he was missing the most crucial element of medieval legitimacy, recognition from the church. And this is where the story becomes even more complex. His own cousin, Afonso VII of León, saw Portugal not as an independent kingdom, but as a rebellious county that needed to be brought back under control. From Alfonso's perspective, his young cousin had gotten a bit too big for his boots and needed to remember his place in the feudal hierarchy. The church found itself in an incredibly delicate position. On one hand, Afonso Henriques was a proven warrior against the Moors, expanding Christian territory and founding monasteries. On the other hand, supporting him meant potentially destabilizing the existing order of Christian kingdoms in Iberia. It was a diplomatic tightrope that would take decades to navigate. What makes Afonso Henriques such a compelling figure is that he wasn't just fighting external enemies, he was battling the very system that had shaped medieval Europe for centuries. He was essentially saying, "I don't need your permission to be a king," while simultaneously desperately needing exactly that permission to make his kingdom legitimate. This internal contradiction would define the next 40 years of his life, as he fought not just Moorish armies, but the complex web of medieval politics, family rivalries, and ecclesiastical diplomacy that would ultimately determine whether Portugal would survive as an independent nation or disappear into the pages of history as just another failed rebellion. Now, Here's something that might surprise you about the 12th century. The Pope wasn't just a religious leader. He was essentially the ultimate political kingmaker of medieval Europe. Think of him as the person who could legitimize or destroy entire kingdoms with a single document. No kingdom could truly exist without papal blessing, and Afonso Henriques understood this better than most. Portugal at this time wasn't really Portugal as we know it today. It was just a disputed territory caught between powerful neighbors, with everyone having their own opinion about who should rule what. But Afonso Henriques was about to play what might be one of the most sophisticated political games in medieval history. He started by doing what any smart medieval ruler would do. He began showering the church with gifts. Land donations flowed like water to various monasteries and religious institutions. He founded new monasteries, supported existing ones, and made sure that every religious leader in his territory knew exactly who was keeping them fed and housed. But this wasn't just generosity. This was strategic investment. Here's where it gets really interesting. Afonso Henriques declared Portugal to be under the direct protection of St. Peter himself, meaning he was placing his entire kingdom under papal authority. This was brilliant, because it bypassed all the complex feudal relationships and obligations that tied other kingdoms together. Instead of being a vassal to León or Castile, Portugal would answer directly to Rome. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of his strategy was how he used the ongoing Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Iberian lands from the Moors, to his advantage. Every victory against Muslim forces wasn't just a military triumph. It was a religious crusade that earned him favor with the church. He was literally fighting God's war, and that gave him immense credibility in Rome. Now, here's a story that really shows you just how far Afonso Henriques was willing to go to secure his kingdom's future. Around 1144, tensions arose with the Bishop of Porto over territorial and jurisdictional disputes. Instead of engaging in lengthy diplomatic negotiations, Afonso took a rather direct approach. He essentially held the bishop under house arrest until they could reach an agreement. This wasn't the action of a desperate man, but rather a calculated political move. Afonso knew that controlling the narrative with church officials was crucial, and sometimes that meant having very frank, face-to-face conversations about mutual interests. The bishop eventually became one of his supporters, understanding that a strong, independent Portugal was better for the church than a weak territory constantly at war. What's remarkable is how Afonso Henriques managed to balance respect for church authority with his own royal ambitions. He genuinely seemed to believe that his kingdom was part of God's plan, but he also understood that faith without political acumen was worthless in the medieval world. He established a pattern that would define Portuguese relations with the church for centuries: deep religious devotion combined with shrewd political maneuvering. Every monastery he founded, every land donation he made, every oath of loyalty he swore to Rome was simultaneously an act of faith and a chess move in the great game of medieval politics. And it was working. Slowly but surely, word was reaching Rome that this young king in the western corner of Iberia wasn't just another ambitious nobleman. He was a genuine ally of the church, expanding Christian territory and creating stability in a region that had known little but warfare for generations. By 1143, Afonso Henriques had achieved something remarkable. His own cousin, Afonso VII of León, finally agreed to recognize Portugal's independence through the Treaty of Zamora. After years of family rivalry and political tension, it seemed like the dream of an independent Portugal was finally becoming reality. But here's the thing about medieval politics. Getting one powerful person to recognize you is just the beginning of the battle. The treaty was significant, don't get me wrong. It meant that León would no longer treat Portugal as a rebellious county that needed to be brought back under control. Afonso VII would address his cousin as an equal, king to king. But there was still that missing piece of the puzzle: the sacred seal of papal approval. Without Rome's blessing, Portugal remained in a kind of political limbo, legitimate in some eyes but questionable in others. And this is where time became Afonso Henriques' greatest enemy. Years began to pass. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. The Pope seemed content to let the situation in Iberia remain unsettled while dealing with other pressing matters across Europe. Meanwhile, Afonso Henriques was getting older, and an uncomfortable truth was becoming clearer with each passing season. If he died without securing papal recognition, everything he had built might crumble. What many people don't realize is that medieval kingdoms were incredibly fragile things. They often lived and died with their founding rulers. Without clear, unquestionable legitimacy, Portugal could easily fragment back into competing territories or be absorbed by neighboring kingdoms after Afonso's death. His son might claim the throne, but would other European powers recognize that claim? This uncertainty created a dangerous opportunity for those who had never fully accepted Portuguese independence. Within Afonso's own court, a shadow network of nobles began to form. These weren't necessarily evil men. Many genuinely believed that Portugal's future would be more secure as part of a larger, more established kingdom like León. They whispered in hallways and exchanged letters, discussing the possibility of negotiating Portugal's peaceful return to León rule after Afonso's death. The most troubling aspect of this conspiracy was how reasonable it seemed to some people. Portugal was small, constantly at war with the Moors, and still lacking full international recognition. León, on the other hand, was established, powerful, and had strong ties throughout Christian Europe. From a purely practical standpoint, reunification might solve a lot of problems. But here's what makes this period so fascinating. Afonso Henriques was fighting a war on multiple fronts, without most people even realizing it. He was still battling Moorish forces in the south, trying to expand Portuguese territory and prove his kingdom's worth. He was managing complex diplomatic relationships with other Christian kingdoms. And now he had to watch his own back, never knowing which of his trusted advisors might be secretly working toward his kingdom's dissolution. The psychological pressure must have been enormous. Imagine spending decades building something, only to realize that the very people you trusted most might be planning to dismantle it the moment you're gone. Every feast, every council meeting, every conversation with nobles became a potential minefield of hidden agendas and divided loyalties. What saved Portugal during this period wasn't just Afonso Henriques' political skill, but his remarkable ability to inspire genuine loyalty among those who truly believed in the Portuguese dream. He surrounded himself with men who had fought beside him, who had seen what an independent Portugal could accomplish, and who understood that some things were worth the risk of uncertainty. The irony is that this internal threat might have actually strengthened Portuguese identity in the long run. Nothing unites people like the knowledge that others want to destroy what they've built together. The awareness that Portugal could disappear at any moment made those who supported it fight even harder for its survival. By the 1170s, Afonso Henriques had reached his 60s, ancient by medieval standards for someone who had spent his life in warfare and politics. The question of papal recognition had become more urgent than ever. If he died without that sacred seal of approval, would Portugal die with him? Did you know that Portugal almost didn't exist because of a betrayal? If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel. And tell us in the comments, do you think Portugal would have survived without the support of the Church? May 23, 1179. Picture the scene in Rome. Pope Alexander III sits in his papal chambers, surrounded by the weight of centuries of church authority. In his hands is a piece of parchment that would change the map of Europe forever. As his scribes prepare the final document, he's about to make a decision that had been 40 years in the making. The Manifestis Probatum wasn't just any papal document. It was the most important piece of paper in Portuguese history. When Alexander III finally put his seal to it, he wasn't just recognizing a king, he was bringing a nation into existence. The words were simple, but earth-shattering. Afonso, King of Portugal, and his kingdom are under the protection of St. Peter and the Holy See. But here's what makes this moment so remarkable. Those weren't just ceremonial words. In the medieval world, being placed under the direct protection of St. Peter meant something profound. It meant that Portugal wasn't just another kingdom among many. It was a special protectorate of the Church itself. Any attack on Portugal would now be seen as an attack on the Holy See. What's fascinating is how long this moment had been building. Afonso Henriques had been king in practice for 40 years, but only now was he king in the eyes of God's representative on earth. Imagine the relief, the validation, the sheer emotional weight of finally achieving something you'd spent your entire adult life pursuing. The timing of the bull reveals something interesting about papal politics. Alexander III had been dealing with complex relationships across Europe, managing disputes between various kingdoms and noble houses. By 1179, the political landscape had shifted enough that recognizing Portugal actually served Rome's broader interests. A strong independent kingdom in Iberia that owed direct allegiance to the Pope was a valuable asset in the ongoing power struggles of medieval Europe. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The bull didn't just recognize Afonso Henriques as king. It also established a principle that would define Portuguese governance for centuries: the idea that Portugal's legitimacy came directly from divine authority, not from feudal relationships with other earthly kingdoms. This made Portugal unique among European nations. The document also did something clever. It acknowledged Portugal's existing borders and conquests, essentially giving retroactive papal approval to 40 years of military expansion. Every castle Afonso had captured, every territory he had claimed, every battle he had won was now blessed by the highest authority in Christendom. When news of the bull reached Portugal, it must have felt like the entire kingdom could finally exhale. The conspirators who had been plotting to return Portugal to León suddenly found their arguments completely undermined. How could anyone argue for abandoning a kingdom that God himself had blessed through his earthly representative? For Afonso Henriques personally, this was vindication on the deepest possible level. He had spent decades being treated as a rebellious upstart by some European courts. Now, at age 69, he could finally call himself king without any qualification or doubt. The boy who had watched his mother seemingly betray Portuguese interests, the young man who had dared to proclaim himself king after Henriques, the mature ruler who had navigated decades of political intrigue. All of that struggle had led to this single, transformative moment. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the Manifestis Probatum was what it represented beyond politics. It was the moment when Portugal stopped being just Afonso Henriques' personal ambition and became something larger, a legitimate nation with its own identity, its own destiny, and its own place in the community of European kingdoms. The bull also established something that would prove crucial for Portugal's future: the principle that Portuguese independence was not dependent on the goodwill of neighboring kingdoms, but was a matter of divine right. This would give Portuguese rulers a powerful argument against any future attempts at annexation or subjugation. From that day forward, Portugal was no longer just a dream or an experiment. It was a sovereign nation, blessed by God, protected by St. Peter, and recognized by the most powerful authority in the medieval world. After 40 years of uncertainty, Portugal had finally, truly, been born. 6 years after receiving papal recognition, in 1185, Afonso Henriques passed away. He was 75 years old, an remarkable age for someone who had spent his entire life in warfare and political struggle. But here's what makes his story truly extraordinary. The kingdom he created didn't die with him. Instead, it grew stronger, eventually becoming something that medieval Europe had never quite seen before. Portugal became what historians now recognize as Europe's first true nation-state. Not just a collection of territories ruled by a powerful family, not just a feudal arrangement between lords and vassals, but a genuine nation united by a common language, a shared legal system, and a unified faith. This might sound obvious to us today, but in the 12th century, it was revolutionary. Think about it. Most medieval kingdoms were patchworks of different peoples, languages, and traditions held together by personal loyalty to a king. But Portugal developed something different. From the northern mountains to the southern coasts, people began to think of themselves not just as subjects of a ruler, but as Portuguese. They shared stories, songs, and customs that were distinctly their own. The language itself tells this story beautifully. What we now call Portuguese began to emerge as distinct from other Romance languages during this period. It wasn't imposed from above. It grew organically as people from different regions found themselves part of the same political and cultural project. The Manifestis Probatum had given them permission to be different, to be themselves. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Portugal's development was how it balanced unity with diversity. The kingdom absorbed influences from its Christian neighbors to the north and east, from the sophisticated Muslim cultures it was conquering in the south, and even from Jewish communities that had found refuge within its borders. Rather than trying to eliminate these influences, Portugal wove them into something new. The legal system that developed reflects this perfectly. Portuguese law drew from Roman traditions, Germanic customs, Islamic practices where they proved useful, and canon law from the church. It was practical, flexible, and above all, Portuguese. No other European kingdom was quite managing this kind of cultural synthesis. Here's something that might surprise you. The economic foundation that Afonso Henriques established also played a huge role in Portugal's survival as an independent nation. By encouraging trade, supporting artisans, and developing agriculture, he had created a kingdom that could actually sustain itself. Portugal wasn't just a military conquest, it was a functioning society. The religious dimension of Portuguese identity proved equally crucial. The special relationship with Rome that the Manifestis Probatum had established gave Portugal a unique position in medieval Christendom. Portuguese knights weren't just fighting for land or glory, they were literally fighting holy wars blessed by the Pope himself. This gave their conquests during the Reconquista a legitimacy and purpose that inspired generations. And all of this traced back to that single piece of parchment sealed in Rome in 1179. It's almost incredible when you think about it, how much of Portuguese history, culture, and identity can be traced to one papal document. Without it, the Iberian Peninsula might have developed completely differently. Maybe there would have been just two kingdoms, Castile and León. Maybe Portugal would have been absorbed into Spain centuries earlier. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. Portugal's independence, secured by the Manifestis Probatum, would eventually lead to one of the most extraordinary chapters in human history. The maritime discoveries, the global empire, the spreading of Portuguese language and culture to 4 continents, none of that would have been possible without the foundation that Afonso Henriques and Pope Alexander III laid in the 12th century. When we look at the modern world, we take the concept of national sovereignty for granted. Countries exist, they have borders, they have governments, and that seems natural to us. But Portugal's story reminds us how artificial and fragile these constructions really are. How many nations today can trace their independence to a single document, a single moment of recognition, a single act of faith by their founders? The legacy of blood and faith that Afonso Henriques left wasn't just about territory or titles. It was about the radical idea that a small group of people on the edge of Europe could create something entirely their own culture, their own destiny, their own place in history. And amazingly, incredibly, that idea worked. 800 years later, Portuguese is spoken by over 200 million people worldwide. Portugal remains an independent nation. The dream that began with a young man proclaiming himself king after the Battle of Ourique and culminated with a papal bull in 1179 continues to live and breathe in the modern world. That's the true power of the Manifestis Probatum. It didn't just create a medieval kingdom, it unleashed a force that would shape the entire planet. So here we are, at the end of one of the most remarkable stories in medieval history. The Manifestis Probatum wasn't just a document, it was the birth certificate of an empire that would eventually span 4 continents. Think about that for a moment. A piece of parchment sealed in Rome in 1179 would ultimately lead to Portuguese explorers reaching the coasts of Brazil, the spice markets of India, and the trading ports of Macau. Afonso Henriques, the king who dared to defy destiny itself, had proven something profound about the nature of power and legitimacy. Yes, he was a skilled military commander who won crucial battles. Yes, he was a shrewd politician who navigated the complex world of medieval diplomacy. But what truly secured his kingdom's future wasn't just the strength of his sword arm or the cleverness of his strategies. It was his understanding that sometimes, to create something that will last, you need more than earthly power. You need that divine endorsement, that sacred seal of approval that transforms a personal ambition into a holy mission. The blessing of God, channeled through the Pope in Rome, gave Portugal something that mere military conquest never could: unshakable legitimacy. This is what makes medieval history so fascinating. We live in an age where we tend to think of politics and religion as separate spheres, but in the 12th century, they were completely intertwined. A king without God's approval was just a successful warlord. A kingdom without papal recognition was just a temporary arrangement waiting to collapse. But Afonso Henriques understood this game better than most. He knew that building a nation required more than conquest. It required faith, patience, and the ability to convince the most powerful people in the world that your dream was worth supporting. For 40 years, he played this game with extraordinary skill, never losing sight of his ultimate goal. The story of the Manifestis Probatum reminds us that some of history's most important moments happen not on battlefields, but in quiet chambers where powerful people make decisions that reshape the world. When Pope Alexander III picked up his pen on that day in May 1179, he was doing more than acknowledging a king. He was setting in motion forces that would influence global history for centuries to come. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of this entire story. It shows us that even in an age we often think of as brutal and primitive, people were capable of extraordinary vision and patience. Afonso Henriques could have settled for being a successful count or duke, controlling his territory through force and accepting his place in the existing order. Instead, he dared to imagine something greater and spent his entire life making that vision real. Today, when we look at a map and see Portugal as just another European country, it's easy to forget how miraculous its very existence really is. This small nation on the edge of Europe, with its distinct language, culture, and identity, exists because one man refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on him, and because the most powerful institution in medieval Europe decided his dream was worth blessing. That's the true legacy of the Manifestis Probatum. Not just the creation of a medieval kingdom, but the proof that sometimes, with enough faith, patience, and political skill, it really is possible to change the world. And it all began with the blessing of God and the stroke of a papal pen. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of medieval history's most fascinating political dramas, I'd love to have you join our community here at the Medieval Archives. Hit that like button to let me know this story resonated with you. And please share it with anyone who loves history. These incredible medieval stories deserve to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started exploring the amazing world of the Middle Ages. From forgotten battles that changed the course of empires to the intimate human stories behind the great political movements of the past, there's so much more to discover together. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the most crucial factor in Portugal's successful quest for independence? Was it Afonso Henriques' military skill, his political genius, or that all-important papal blessing? The medieval world was full of ambitious rulers, but very few achieved what he accomplished. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of how faith, politics, and human determination combined to create a nation. Until our next medieval adventure, keep exploring the past, because understanding where we came from helps us better appreciate the remarkable world we live in today.